My father lifted his champagne glass and smiled like he had been waiting all night to embarrass me. "Still broke, Naomi?" he said. "Everything you have came from my name. Without me, you'd be nobody. Don't expect a cent from my inheritance." A few people looked down at their plates. Then my phone buzzed beside the crystal stemware. "Miss Calder, Founder Control Trust, Naomi Control Phase. Active. Your founder voting block is now under your direct control. Current implied equity value, $14.3 billion. I read it twice, looked back at Dad, and said, "Keep it. I don't need what you use to think you control my life. Stay with me, because before that Christmas dinner was over, my father would learn what his money could no longer buy, and if you enjoy stories about family, power, and consequences, subscribe to the channel and keep listening." 40 minutes earlier, I had handed my 6-year-old sedan to a valet beneath a canopy of white lights outside one of Chicago's most expensive hotels. The man taking my keys did not care what year the car was. My father did. Richard Calder noticed details the way other people noticed weather. Watches, shoes, neighborhoods, schools, the names printed on wine labels. By the time I entered the private dining room he had reserved for December 23rd, he had already arranged the evening into the kind of picture he liked. Evergreen branches along the windows, candles reflected in crystal, a tasting menu with more courses than anyone needed, and a view of the river darkening beneath winter lights. Dad looked at my keys when I set them beside my phone and asked whether I was still driving that old thing. The remark was light enough to invite polite laughter. Eli smiled into his wine glass. Mom touched Dad's wrist and told him not to start. I smiled too, because I had learned years ago that refusing a joke could become a larger offense than the joke itself. In our family, broke did not mean unable to pay rent. It meant failing to display success in a form Dad recognized. The dinner moved the way Calder dinners usually did. Dad asked Eli about a hotel acquisition at Calder Heritage Group, then about the children's school, then about whether he and Mara had decided to keep their club membership. Each answer became a number or a marker on some invisible board in Dad's head. Eli had done well at the company. His suit was custom, his mortgage belonged to a neighborhood Dad approved of, and his life fit neatly inside the system that had rewarded us since childhood. Whenever we made choices, Richard Calder understood. I had stopped fitting years ago. When Dad turned to me, he did not pretend Meridian Loop was a failure. That would have been too ridiculous, even for him. The company had grown far beyond the logistics software project he once dismissed, and its name had appeared often enough in business coverage that he knew it was valuable. What he believed was that I had given most of that value away. I had spent years raising outside capital while keeping my personal holdings private, and my life gave him no reason to revise his assumption. I rented a 2-bedroom condo. I wore good clothes without logos. I had never bought the lake house he once insisted. Every successful Calder should eventually own. Dad said founders loved being photographed, while investors quietly ended up owning the real prize. He asked how much I had actually managed to keep after all those rounds. I told him I was doing fine and cut into the next course. That answer bothered him more than defensiveness would have. He reminded me that when Meridian Loop was young, I could have taken family capital instead of making everything harder. In his version of history, his money would have meant a safer stake, a larger office, a house before 30, and a respectable place inside the Calder network. He did not mention the conditions that had come with the offer. I did not either. Not yet. Mom tried to turn the conversation toward dessert, praising the pastry chef and asking Eli about the children's Christmas morning plans. Dad let her redirect us for less than a minute. Then his attention returned to me. I could see the familiar irritation in the way he rested 2 fingers against the stem of his glass. My refusal to argue had always frustrated him because it denied him the chance to win in public. He lifted the champagne. The room went quiet before he even spoke. "Still broke, Naomi?" A brief, uncertain laugh moved around the table. Eli stopped smiling. Mom looked down at her napkin. Dad continued, no longer pretending he was teasing. He said everything I had came from the Calder name, that without him I would be nobody, and that I should not expect a cent from his inheritance. The words should have been absurd. I was 31 years old. I paid my own bills, built my own company, and had not asked him for money in years. But humiliation rarely follows logic. For 1 second, I was 24 again, sitting across from him with a funding proposal between us, while he explained how much easier my life could be if I simply accepted that the person writing the check deserved the final word. My hand had tightened around my water glass without me noticing. I loosened my fingers one by one. Then, my phone vibrated against the tablecloth. I almost ignored it. Meridian Loop had been closing a financing transaction that week, but Jordan and I had already agreed that anything routine could wait until after dinner. The notification preview carried the name of the trust administrator, so I turned the phone over. The message was only a few lines. The 5-year independent voting arrangement we had established in 2021 had reached its contractual end after the final conditions were satisfied. The Naomi control phase was active. My 31.8% post-money founder block was back under my direct voting control. At the financing price that had just closed, its implied value was approximately $14.3 billion. I did not suddenly feel $14 billion richer. The candles burned exactly as they had 10 seconds earlier. A server moved silently behind Eli's chair. Snow pressed against the windows in thin, dry streaks. Dad was still watching me, with the faint satisfaction of a man who thought my silence meant his threat had landed. The number itself was not what changed the moment for me. It was the fact that he still believed there was a number of his that could make me obey. I read the notification a second time, locked my phone, and looked at him. Keep it. I don't need what you use to think you control my life. Dad's expression did not collapse dramatically. His smile simply stopped belonging on his face. He asked what that was supposed to mean. I told him something I had built had just become mine to control again. He dismissed it at first, calling the wording deliberately grand. He had spent too many years around money to be impressed by vague claims, and I could almost see him searching for the smaller explanation. Options, theoretical valuation, a title without authority. I did not give him the financial lecture he wanted. I unlocked the message, held the screen across the table just long enough for him to see my name and the line containing $14.3 billion, then pulled it back. The color around his mouth changed. Eli leaned forward, but I put the phone into my bag. Mom started to say my name in the soft warning tone she had used all my life whenever truth threatened the evening. I was already standing. I thanked no one for dinner. I made no announcement about being richer than Dad, because that was not what the message said, and more importantly, that was not the point. I put on my coat while the room behind me remained strangely still. The expensive dinner, the champagne, the hotel suite of a dining room, none of it looked different. Only the hierarchy Dad had assumed was permanent had developed a crack. I reached the door before his voice followed me. There was no mockery left in it now. How much of that company do you actually own? Dad's question followed me out of the private dining room, even after the door closed behind me. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my pulse had begun to catch up with everything that had happened upstairs. The hotel was still full of Christmas music and polished marble and people carrying shopping bags through arrangements of white poinsettias, as if nothing had changed. My phone began vibrating before the valet brought my car around. Mom called first. I watched her name disappear, then reappear almost immediately. Eli called while she was still trying again. A message followed from Mom asking me to come back before Dad assumed the worst. That phrase almost made me laugh. Dad had spent most of dinner assuming the worst about me. What she meant was that he now lacked an explanation he could control. Eli's message was simpler. He wanted to know whether what he had seen on my screen was real. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine and looked at the notification again. The words had not changed. The 5-year governance period Jordan and I had agreed to, when we placed my founder block under independent voting control, had ended exactly as planned. The financing conditions were complete. The successor control phase was active. At the price established by the financing that had just closed, the implied value attached to my block, was roughly $14.3 billion. That number was enormous enough to look fictional even to me, but it was not cash sitting in an account. It was not a lottery ticket, an inheritance, or a check someone had decided to hand me for Christmas. It was the current paper value of equity I had held through years when Dad assumed I had surrendered almost everything worth owning. I did not answer Eli yet. Dad sent one message before I pulled away from the hotel. He accused me of staging the reveal because I wanted to humiliate him in front of the family. He said private company valuations were often inflated. Voting structures were complicated, and I had deliberately used language that made the situation sound larger than it probably was. In his version, some trustee, board, investor group, or legal structure still had to be standing between me and the number I had shown him. I read the message at a red light and felt something colder than anger settle into place. Even after seeing my name beside $14.3 billion, Dad's first instinct was to search for the man, institution, or mechanism that must actually be in charge. He still could not imagine that the answer might be me. Jordan called when I was halfway home. I answered through the car system because, unlike my family, she had a reason to be calling that night that had nothing to do with Christmas dinner. The financing had closed cleanly, the final contractual condition had been satisfied, and the administrator had moved my founder shares into the successor control phase written into the arrangement 5 years earlier. The independent period had served its purpose and reached the end we had planned for it. Jordan waited until she knew I understood the closing details before allowing herself one small celebration. You control $14 billion in equity and still have that cracked phone case. I glanced at the phone resting in its dashboard cradle. A thin fracture ran across one corner of the clear case where I had dropped it outside the office months earlier. The phone works. Jordan laughed. There was no judgment in it, and no attempt to tell me what I should buy now that a spreadsheet said I was worth more than I had been that morning. She congratulated me, reminded me that the authorized financing announcement would go out later that evening, and let the conversation return briefly to ordinary company matters before we hung up. That normality steadied me more than the number had. I had barely taken off my coat at home when Dad called. This time I answered. I stood at the kitchen counter while Chicago lights reflected against the windows of my condo. Dad did not apologize for dinner. He returned instead to the history he preferred, the schools he had paid for, the executives I had met at Calder events, and the business world I had been allowed to see early. I acknowledged those advantages because pretending I had started from nothing would have been dishonest. What I would not accept was his leap from giving me a head start to owning every achievement that followed. There was a long silence after I said that. I could hear faint movement at his end, but I did not try to imagine his face. When he spoke again, he shifted back toward numbers, questioning what control meant, and suggesting investors must still hold the real power. I stopped the conversation before it became a finance seminar designed to return him to familiar ground. Meridian Loop would release what it intended to release publicly. My private holdings were not something I owed him because he happened to be my father. We ended without agreement. About 40 minutes later, someone knocked on my door. Eli stood in the hallway with his coat still buttoned, and the expression of a man who had spent the drive arguing with himself. I let him in. He had been to my condo before, but that night he looked around as if the furniture might reveal something he had missed. There was no hidden Picasso on the wall, no staff moving through the kitchen, no evidence that I had spent years secretly living like the billionaire he now imagined. My place looked exactly as it had the last time he visited. 2 bedrooms. Books stacked beside the sofa. A dining table I also used when I worked from home. A kitchen with one cabinet that never closed correctly unless I pushed the corner first. Eli sat at the table while I made coffee. Most of what he wanted to know came out without accusation at first. He had spent the drive trying to understand how a person could possess equity worth billions and still live the way I did. He had assumed founders became wealthy when they sold shares or took companies public. To him, the number on my phone and the condo around us seemed to belong to 2 different lives. I explained only what mattered. Private company equity was not the same thing as cash. Meridian Loop's new financing had sharply increased the implied value of my stake. The founder block had existed for years, but the voting control arrangement had changed that day, according to terms set long ago. I could not walk into a bank tomorrow morning and withdraw $14 billion. He understood the mechanics quickly enough. What he did not understand was me. His eyes moved from my face toward the mug in his hands. The anger came quieter than Dad's had. "Have you been letting us think you were struggling all this time?" The question landed harder than anything Dad had said after I left the hotel. I started to explain that I had never told anyone I was poor. Eli stopped me with a look before I finished. He reminded me of family dinners, where Dad joked about my apartment, holidays when relatives assumed I could not afford certain trips, conversations where he himself had offered advice about buying property because he thought I was putting everything into the company and had little left for myself. I had not lied. But I had allowed a false conclusion to live comfortably around me because correcting it would have required opening a door I had spent years keeping shut. "I never asked you for money," I said. "That's not what I asked." There was no good answer waiting behind my pride. I had told myself my finances were private. They were. I had told myself Dad would only turn success into another weapon if he knew more. He probably would have. But sitting across from Eli, I could see something I had avoided acknowledging. Dad was not the only person I had kept outside. Privacy had protected me so effectively that eventually nobody could tell where privacy ended and distance began. Eli left without congratulating me. I did not blame him. Later that evening, my phone began lighting up again, but this time it was not family. Meridian Loop had issued the financing announcement exactly as planned. Business outlets picked it up quickly. The company's post-money valuation was reported at approximately $45 billion. The announcement identified Jordan and me as co-founders and confirmed that, under Meridian Loop's pre-existing governance arrangement, I had resumed direct voting control over my founder shares. It did not publish my exact percentage. That remained private, but the part Dad had been trying to dismiss was now impossible to erase. I was not a salaried employee pretending that someone else's shares belonged to me. I was not misunderstanding a trustee's message. The company itself had confirmed that my founder voting rights were back under my control. For several minutes, I expected Dad to call. He did not. Mom did. She sounded tired. She told me Dad had read the coverage and had already found a new explanation. According to him, the real issue was no longer whether I had succeeded. The problem was that I had spent years playing poor, allowing everyone to believe one thing while privately knowing another. Eli had apparently said little. Dad had filled the silence for him. Standing beside my kitchen window, I understood that the argument had moved. Dad could no longer deny my success, so he changed the accusation. The question was no longer whether I had built Meridian Loop without his control. It was what kind of daughter would let her family believe she was struggling while keeping the truth to herself. Christmas morning arrived without the Calder version of Christmas. There was no private dining room, no staff replacing plates before they cooled, no champagne chosen because somebody had once served it to a senator or a hotel investor. I woke late in my condo to the muted gray light of a Chicago December and the sound of a snowplow grinding somewhere below my window. My phone had collected messages overnight, most of them variations of the same question, disguised as concern. I left them unanswered long enough to make coffee and stand barefoot in my kitchen while the radiator clicked against the cold. Dad's new accusation had followed me into the morning, playing poor. The phrase was clever because it turned his mistake into my deception. He no longer had to explain why he had spent years calling me financially foolish. He only had to say I had allowed him to believe it. I stared at the steam rising from my mug and remembered the first time he offered to make sure I would never struggle at all. I was 24 when Jordan and I told him we were leaving stable jobs to build Meridian Loop. At the time, the company was barely more than a working product, a handful of pilot customers, and 2 people spending evenings arguing over warehouse data that most investors found painfully unglamorous. Dad reacted with enthusiasm so quickly that for a few days I mistook it for faith in me. He spoke about office space, hiring, introductions, and the advantage of moving before competitors noticed the market. What I did not understand at first was that he had already decided where the money would come from. His offer was far larger than Jordan and I had planned to raise, large enough to remove most of the fear from the first 2 years. We could have hired faster, leased a polished office instead of working from borrowed rooms, and paid ourselves salaries that did not require checking our bank balances before every large personal expense. The money itself was real. So were the terms attached to it. Dad wanted Calder Heritage represented on the board. He wanted veto rights over major financing and senior hires. He wanted the Calder name incorporated into the company's branding, while it was still small enough to be shaped around whatever came next. His family office would oversee the capital and receive reporting access well beyond what a normal early investor would have needed. He described each condition as protection. I remember sitting across from him with the proposal open between us and noticing that he never once used the word control. He did not need to. I had grown up knowing how his generosity worked. The first car he bought me came with opinions about where I drove it and who sat in the passenger seat. Tuition came with a preferred list of majors. Even small things could become evidence later that his judgment deserved more weight than mine. Dad never called it repayment. He called it common sense. If he had helped create the opportunity, he believed he had earned jurisdiction over what happened next. That afternoon, I asked whether he would invest without the control provisions. He refused. Not angrily. That would almost have been easier. He explained that giving substantial money without meaningful influence would be irresponsible. From his perspective, a father protecting his daughter and an investor protecting capital were the same thing. From mine, they were exactly the problem. Jordan and I turned down the offer. The outside money we eventually accepted was smaller and less comfortable. The investors wanted returns, reporting, and normal protections, but they did not want to turn Meridian Loop into an extension of someone else's family empire. We gave up financial ease in exchange for cleaner governance, and spent the next several years living with the consequences of that choice. Our first proper office had stained carpet and a conference room whose heating system seemed to recognize only 2 temperatures, tropical and broken. Jordan and I kept our salaries conservative because hiring engineers mattered more than proving we were founders. When revenue improved, we reinvested. When a larger customer required changes we had not budgeted for, we delayed other plans rather than pulling money out. None of those sacrifices looked noble from the outside. To Dad, they looked like evidence. Every rented apartment, every old car, every year I did not upgrade my life became another exhibit in the case he had built against my decision. He occasionally offered to correct the mistake. There was always a place for me at Calder Heritage, always capital available if I wanted to reconsider, always some version of the sentence that sounded generous until I heard the condition hiding underneath it. Come back inside, and life gets easier. I kept saying no. Mom had been harder to resist because her version never sounded controlling. She reminded me that families were supposed to make one another's lives easier, and she believed accepting help did not make me weak. What she rarely acknowledged was how Dad preserved favors as evidence long after the original problem disappeared. Eventually, I stopped distinguishing between his help and anyone else's. When my car battery died one winter, I rented a car rather than let Jordan drive me for a week. When Eli offered to help move a heavy table, I hired movers. I called it self-sufficiency, but I had begun preferring inconvenience to the sensation of owing someone. By Christmas afternoon, I had answered only necessary messages. Jordan sent a brief update from Meridian Loop, but nothing required action. The company would reopen fully after the holiday. Outside, the snow had thinned to a dirty crust along the street, and the quiet inside my condo made the previous night feel farther away than it was. Eli called near evening. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I thought about the way he had left my kitchen 2 nights earlier without congratulating me, hurt less by the money than by the distance it revealed. I answered. He had spoken with Dad. I could tell from the first minute that Richard had moved from disbelief to authorship. Dad was now telling people that the Calder name had opened the doors that made Meridian Loop possible. He was not claiming he owned my shares. He was doing something more difficult to argue with, taking every advantage I had genuinely received and arranging them into a story where my success could not exist without him. Eli did not repeat all of it. He did not need to. He asked whether Dad had ever invested in Meridian Loop. The question pulled me back to that table 7 years earlier. The oversized offer between us. Dad, waiting for me to recognize how much easier obedience could make my life. No. Eli went quiet, but I knew the answer alone was incomplete. He tried, I said. I chose less money so I could keep the right to say no. For several seconds, I heard nothing but the faint sound of movement on his end of the call. I did not fill the silence. Eli had built a life that looked far more successful than mine had from the outside. A senior role at Calder Heritage, a beautiful home, private school for his children, and a lifestyle built around Dad's company. None of those things made him weak, but they made saying no expensive. I had spent 7 years learning to live with less in order to keep my choices. Eli had spent those same years building a life around everything our father's money made possible. And now, for the first time, he had to consider what saying no might cost him. The first working Monday after Christmas felt almost aggressively ordinary. By 8:30 on December 28th, Meridian Loop was already full of the sounds I associated with every difficult week we had survived before anyone outside the company cared what we were worth. Keyboards clicking behind glass walls. A product team arguing quietly over a deployment schedule. Someone carrying 2 coffees while reading something on a laptop balanced against one forearm. The financing announcement had turned our valuation into a headline, but nobody inside the office had been handed $14 billion over the holiday. There were still customer problems to solve, deadlines to meet, and decisions that would be expensive if we made them badly. I walked past a conference room where 3 engineers were diagramming a logistics failure on a whiteboard and felt the number from Christmas shrink back into proportion. $14.3 billion was the implied value of my founder block at the latest financing price. It was not a crown. It did not make the people in that room less responsible for what Meridian Loop had become. It did not erase Jordan's years beside me, or the hundreds of people whose work had turned an ugly first product into something companies now depended on. For several days, my family had treated the valuation as though it were a character revelation. At work, it was simply one more consequence of what we had built. Jordan found me before lunch and told me Dad had contacted her. That stopped me more effectively than any headline had. Richard had asked for a meeting as family. He had also made it clear that he expected Jordan to help him understand what I now controlled. The phrasing irritated me immediately. Dad had spent years showing limited interest in the details of Meridian Loop because he believed my choices had cost me real authority. Now that he knew otherwise, he suddenly treated information about my company as something family status entitled him to receive. My first instinct was to tell Jordan to ignore him. She did not argue hard. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She simply pointed out that I had spent years managing Dad through distance. I withheld details, avoided situations where he could interfere, and refused conversations before they could become negotiations. Those choices had protected the company. They had also allowed him to construct his own explanation for every blank space. Maybe, Jordan suggested, one short conversation with someone he could not parent would settle at least one part of the story. I agreed on the condition that it was exactly that. A conversation, not access, not a negotiation, and not the beginning of Richard Calder inserting himself into Meridian Loop because he had discovered its value. Dad arrived later that afternoon, carrying the same confidence he brought into hotels, restaurants, and meetings at Calder Heritage. He did not look like a man whose worldview had been shaken over Christmas. He looked composed. Expensive coat, measured voice, controlled expression. That was more familiar than anger. Jordan and I met him in a small conference room rather than my office. Nothing about the room impressed him. That pleased me more than it should have. He started by talking about Meridian Loop's growth, as though we all agreed he had seen its potential early. He referred to conversations from the company's first year and mentioned the capital he had once been prepared to provide. Within minutes, the history had begun shifting around his language. He did not directly say he had founded the company. He did something subtler. He implied that his willingness to back me had made the beginning possible, that his business experience had given the idea credibility, and that my decision to seek outside capital had been a financing preference rather than a refusal of his conditions. Jordan listened without interrupting. Then Dad described his original offer as proof that he had believed in me before institutional investors did. Jordan set down the pen she had been turning between her fingers. "Your offer was bigger," she said. Naomi chose the one that didn't come with a leash. The room became very quiet. There was no folder opened on the table. No old contract slid dramatically across polished wood. Jordan did not need one. She had been there. She had sat beside me when we reviewed both options. She had watched me choose a smaller amount of money, because the larger amount would have allowed my father's company to reach into hiring, financing, branding, and governance. Dad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dad did not deny that his original offer carried those conditions. He changed the frame instead, returning to the advantages he had genuinely given me: elite schools, early exposure to business, and access many founders never get. I had met executives at family events, heard conversations about contracts and risk before most people my age, and never carried the kind of student debt that can narrow a young founder's choices before the first pitch. For once, I agreed without feeling trapped by the agreement. Those advantages were real. Pretending otherwise would turn my independence into another family myth. "I had a head start," I said. "That doesn't mean you own every mile I walked after it." I could be grateful for what he had given me and still refuse the idea that gratitude transferred authorship of every decision afterward. Jordan remained mostly silent after that. The point had landed. Dad did not need a second witness repeating it until he surrendered. What changed next was his strategy. Dad stopped arguing about Meridian Loop and reminded me that his own property was still his to decide his estate, his company, and the discretionary privileges connected to the Calder family. I had already told him to keep my inheritance. What tightened my stomach was hearing him speak about family privileges in the plural. He had not accepted defeat. He had found the part of the battlefield where my founder shares did not make his money irrelevant. That evening, Mom called. Her voice was quieter than it had been on Christmas night. She did not ask me to apologize. She did not repeat Dad's claim that I had been playing poor. Instead, she warned me that he had spent the afternoon talking about rewriting everything. She tried to make it sound like anger that would pass. I knew that habit in her, the instinct to soften a threat until everyone could sleep beside it. This time, the words would not soften. I asked what he meant. Mom said only that Dad had been talking about his estate, future support, and whether people who questioned him should continue benefiting from what he had built. She sounded uncomfortable repeating even that much. I stood in my kitchen after the call ended, staring at the same counter where Eli had sat a few nights earlier. At Christmas, Dad had threatened to take my inheritance away because he believed it could still frighten me. It could not. But Eli's salary came from Calder heritage. Mom's life was woven into Dad's money, social world, and decisions. Other comforts and future expectations still existed inside the system I had spent years escaping. For the first time, I understood what Dad was preparing to do. If his money could no longer control me, he was going to find out who else could still be controlled by it. Eli came to see me 2 days after Dad's meeting at Meridian Loop, and this time he did not look confused. He looked tired. There was a difference. Confusion still leaves room for curiosity. Exhaustion narrows everything. He sat at the same kitchen table where he had asked whether I had been secretly rich and kept both hands around a mug he barely touched. His coat stayed on the back of the chair. His phone rested face down between us. I did not ask what Dad had said. Eli told me because he had reached the point where keeping the conversation inside his own head had become harder than repeating it. Dad had called him in after Christmas and made the connection explicit. Loyalty to Calder heritage and loyalty to the family were not, in Richard Calder's mind, separate things. If Eli publicly supported my account of Meridian Loop, challenged Dad's version of my success, or helped turn the family against him, then Dad would reconsider what Eli should expect later: bonuses, discretionary support, and eventually inheritance. Eli repeated the one sentence that had stayed with him: grown men who wanted independence should be prepared to finance it themselves. That line landed differently on Eli than it had on me. I had spent years arranging my life, so Dad's withdrawal could not collapse it. Eli had done the opposite, without ever meaning to. His mortgage, the children's private school, company car and club benefits, and much of their social life had grown around his Calder heritage compensation. Mara's work as a pediatric physical therapist gave them stability, and they had roughly 7 months of essential expense savings if they cut discretionary spending, but leaving would still mean a probable pay cut and real household changes. He had built a life in which every ordinary decision assumed the next Calder paycheck would arrive. That did not make him helpless, and it did not make the choices foolish when he made them. It simply meant the door out was attached to a real price. Eli had skills and could find work. He could not pretend leaving would be painless. I watched him rub his thumb along the edge of his coffee mug and remembered how easy it had been, from the outside, to treat his choices as weakness. For years, I had looked at Eli's closeness to Dad and assumed he simply preferred comfort to independence. Sitting across from him, I could finally see the trap more clearly. Financial control rarely works because someone has literally locked the door. It works because the door opens onto a life that will become smaller the moment you walk through it. Eli admitted something I had not expected. He said he had spent years laughing along when Dad teased me about my apartment, my car, or the way I lived because my choices made him uncomfortable. If I had really been doing fine without Calder money, then his own dependence became harder to describe as merely practical. It was easier to believe I was stubborn, financially reckless, or secretly struggling than to ask whether he had built too much of his life around Dad's approval. He did not ask me to forgive that. I respected him more for not trying. Later that afternoon, Mom came by. Meredith had never needed threats to become an effective part of Dad's system. She worked through soft edges. She sat on my sofa with her handbag beside her and spent several minutes talking around the real reason she was there before finally admitting Dad wanted one thing from me. Not money, not shares, a sentence. He wanted me to say publicly, within the family, that his support and the Calder name had given me the foundation for Meridian Loop's success. Mom presented it as a compromise. I did not have to say he founded the company. I did not have to change the ownership facts. I only had to acknowledge his role strongly enough that he could stop feeling humiliated. Financially, the sentence would have cost me nothing. That was what made the request dangerous. For most of my life, our family had treated truth as the most flexible thing in the room. If changing a few words prevented Dad from becoming angry, then we changed the words. If a story could be softened so dinner continued, we softened it. Nobody called that lying. We called it keeping the peace. I told Mom I had already acknowledged the advantages Dad gave me. I would not turn those advantages into authorship because he needed a better story. Her shoulders dropped slightly. She did not argue much after that. She simply looked disappointed, in the way only a parent can look disappointed, while still pretending the disappointment is concern. When she left, the condo felt too quiet. For the first time since Christmas, I opened my laptop and looked at the problem the way I would have looked at a business problem. Eli needed an exit. I had resources. The solution seemed insultingly simple. Meridian Loop could afford to hire talented operators, and I could make Eli's exit almost painless. A salary while he figured out what came next, help with the mortgage or tuition, enough money to keep his family's life from shrinking. For several minutes, I let myself imagine how quickly I could erase his fear. The fact that it felt so good was what frightened me. Jordan called, while I was still staring at the screen. I told her only enough to explain why I was distracted. She listened, then asked one question. If Eli left Dad because I guaranteed him a better landing, whose money would he be depending on next? I closed the laptop. The answer was too obvious once somebody else said it. Replacing Richard as the person who could make another adult's fear disappear would not destroy the system. It would only change the name on the account. That evening, Eli returned. This time, he did not circle around what he wanted. If I walk away from Dad, will you give me a job? The question hurt because I already knew what I wanted to say. Yes. I wanted to tell him Meridian Loop would take him. I wanted to tell him his children would stay in the same school, his mortgage would remain manageable, and nothing about his life had to shrink because our father had decided obedience was part of compensation. I could have ended his fear in one sentence. Instead, I told him I would help him think through options. I would review his resume. I would introduce him to people where the connection was honest and relevant. If somebody asked me about his abilities, I would give a truthful reference. I would sit with him and Mara and help think through what a lower income transition could actually look like if they wanted that. But I would not guarantee him a job simply because he was my brother, and I would not buy his exit from Dad. Eli's face changed before he stood. He had heard every practical offer as a refusal of the one thing he wanted most: certainty. He pushed his chair back and picked up his coat. The anger came from somewhere deeper than entitlement. I could see fear underneath it, which made the words sting more rather than less. "It's easy for you to refuse him," he said. "You have $14 billion. Then he walked out, leaving the coffee on the table untouched. Eli's words stayed in my kitchen long after he left. "It's easy for you to refuse him. You have $14 billion. I carried Eli's untouched coffee to the sink and poured it out, but his accusation stayed with me. When I refused Dad's investment at 24, I had been single and responsible only for myself. Eli was 35, with a wife, 2 children, a mortgage, tuition bills, and a life built around the income he was considering leaving. That did not make my boundary wrong, but it forced me to look at the parts of my own behavior money could not vindicate. 2 days later, Mom said what Eli had already implied. For years, I had let people who loved me build a false picture of my life because correcting them felt more dangerous than distance. She remembered dinners where Dad mocked my apartment and I let the joke stand, times Eli offered advice I did not need because he genuinely believed the company had swallowed almost everything I earned. From their side, my silence had not looked like a carefully drawn boundary. It had looked like trust withheld. Dad sharpened that criticism into a claim that I had enjoyed the secrecy and had been waiting for a moment when everyone else would look foolish. That motive was unfair. I had never planned the Christmas reveal, and the timing had surprised me as much as it shocked them. Still, I could admit the part beneath his distortion. I had protected private information for good reasons and also allowed privacy to become a wall. A cap table could prove what I owned. It could not prove that I had let the people around me know me. That realization followed me into work. The week after Christmas was brutal in the ordinary way. Fast-growing companies could be brutal. The financing close had generated new expectations, press attention, internal questions, and a list of decisions that seemed to multiply every time I finished one. By late afternoon one day, I had been at my desk so long that the light outside my office had changed from gray to black without me noticing. Jordan appeared with takeout. She had brought enough for both of us. My answer came before she finished setting the bag down. "I'm fine." Jordan looked at the untouched protein bar beside my laptop, then at me. Her eyes moved to my phone. The cracked corner of the case caught the overhead light. She laughed once under her breath and said that apparently I could control billions of dollars in founder equity, but still could not let another human being buy me dinner or a $20 phone case. I almost told her the phone still worked. The sentence reached my mouth and stopped there. I had said some version of it my entire adult life. "I'm fine. I've got it. It still works. I don't need anything." The words had become so automatic that I had mistaken them for personality. Jordan sat across from me and opened the containers without waiting for permission. She did not make a speech. She simply pushed one toward my side of the desk and started eating her own food while reading something on her tablet. I stared at the container for several seconds. Then I picked up the fork. The first few bites tasted like nothing because my mind had already gone somewhere else. I thought about the rental car I paid for when Jordan once offered me rides. The movers I hired instead of letting Eli carry a table. The countless small moments when someone reached toward me and I stepped aside before I had to wonder what accepting would cost later. Richard had trained me well. Not in business, in debt. He had taught me that kindness could remain alive forever as evidence. I told Jordan that when people helped me, part of me still heard Dad's future voice before they had even finished the favor. After everything I did for you. The sentence existed in my head, like interest accruing on a loan nobody else knew I had taken. Saying it aloud embarrassed me more than admitting the value of my shares ever had. Jordan did not tell me I was damaged, or that everything was Dad's fault. She only said healthy help should leave the person receiving it with more choices afterward, not fewer. That distinction sat between us. More choices, not fewer. Dad's investment offer had been huge, but it would have reduced my choices. Jordan bringing dinner did not give her a vote over what I did tomorrow. Eli carrying furniture would not have entitled him to decide where I lived. I had spent years reacting to one man's definition of generosity as though it were the universal rule. The armor had worked. It had also become heavy. Over the next several days, I stopped trying to win every family argument with the correct fact. The instinct was still there. If Dad said his name built Meridian Loop, I wanted to reach for the financing history. If Mom said I had hidden too much, I wanted to separate every private fact from every false assumption. If Eli said independence was easy for me now, I wanted to list all the years when it had not been. But facts could not repair every relationship. Dad could be wrong about my motives, while Mom and Eli could still be right that I had let privacy become distance. I could acknowledge privilege without surrendering authorship of my life. Most importantly, I would not turn $14 billion into a counter-inheritance. If I erased every consequence Dad threatened, everyone would still be making choices under financial pressure. Only the source of that pressure would change. I was still working through that decision when Dad sent the family message. He announced that after New Year's, he wanted one final gathering. No celebration this time, no hotel dining room, no Christmas performance. He said there were questions about loyalty, family expectations, and the future of his estate that needed to be settled before he made permanent decisions. Mom called it dramatic. Eli did not respond at all. I read Dad's message twice and placed my phone face down on the desk. At Christmas, I had believed the $14.3 billion message had ended his power over me. Now I understood the real test was about to begin. Dad was going to ask everyone where they stood. And for the first time in my life, I had decided not to pay anyone to choose my side. I asked Eli to meet me somewhere. Neither of us could mistake for territory. Not Meridian Loop, where $14.3 billion had become a headline attached to my name. Not Calder Heritage, where every hallway reminded him who signed his paycheck. I chose a small cafe on a quiet Chicago street, the kind of place where nobody cared what company either of us worked for, as long as we moved our laptops when the lunch crowd arrived. Eli was already there when I walked in. He had lost some of the anger he carried out of my condo, but not the hurt underneath it. I could see that before he said anything. His shoulders were tight beneath his coat, and he had chosen a table near the window where dirty snow had gathered along the curb outside. I did not start with Dad. I apologized for something that belonged to me. For years, I had told myself privacy was a boundary. Sometimes it was, but I had also used it as distance. I let Eli believe I was struggling because correcting him would have required letting him closer to a part of my life I had trained myself to protect. I had never given him the chance to know the adult version of me that existed outside our father's judgment. That did not mean I owed him my cap table or every private financial detail. It meant he deserved more than silence. When silence was allowing a false picture of his sister to harden into fact, Eli listened without interrupting. I did not apologize for turning down Dad's investment. I did not apologize for building Meridian Loop outside the Calder system. Those choices had cost me too much to pretend I regretted them, simply because the consequences had become uncomfortable for everyone else. When I finished, Eli looked down at the coffee between his hands. His anger had changed shape, but one part remained. He still thought my refusal to guarantee him a job was cold. I understood why. From where he sat, Dad had made loyalty financially dangerous, and I possessed enough wealth on paper to remove the danger without changing my own life in any noticeable way. I could make one call, create one executive role, and give Eli a bridge so wide he would never have to look down. That was exactly why I could not do it. If you leave him for my money, nothing changes, except whose money you're afraid to lose. Eli's eyes lifted to mine. I let the sentence remain there, instead of building a speech around it. I told him I would stand beside him while he figured out his options, but I would not preserve his current lifestyle in exchange for a new dependence on me. If I guaranteed that the mortgage, tuition, vacations, and every other comfort would remain untouched, he could leave Dad without ever confronting what had made Dad's leverage work. When Eli asked what help I actually was willing to give, I named the practical things: resume feedback, honest introductions, interview preparation, truthful references, and help thinking through a lower-cost transition. None of those things promised the outcome. They gave him more room to choose. That was the difference I was trying to learn myself. He asked what happened if every realistic outside position paid less. I told him then the question was not whether leaving Dad preserved his old life perfectly. The question was whether that old life was worth the conditions now attached to it. Eli did not answer. For once, I did not need him to. Over the next several days, he began doing things quietly. He contacted people outside Calder Heritage and revised a resume that had not needed revision in years. He discovered that his experience was respected outside Dad's company, but the Calder surname did not automatically carry the same weight once employers knew he would not be bringing family business with him. One realistic opportunity surfaced: solid work with less prestige and substantially lower pay. Eli and Mara then calculated what 7 months of essential expense savings would actually buy them. The club membership and a major vacation could go. Dinners and status spending could shrink. School costs would be reconsidered at the next enrollment point, rather than through a panicked mid-year move. Mara's salary gave them stability, but not the lifestyle built around Eli's old compensation. For the first time, saying no to Dad had numbers attached to it instead of just principles. I stayed out of the decision as much as I could. Whenever I felt the urge to say I could cover tuition or make the mortgage irrelevant, I remembered the look on Eli's face when he asked whether I would give him a job. He had not wanted employment as much as certainty. Dad had sold certainty to us for years. I was learning not to. At Meridian Loop, the new year had begun with enough work to keep me occupied if I wanted an excuse to disappear into it. A complicated commitment landed on my calendar during the same week I expected the Calder family situation to become worse. It was exactly the kind of thing I would normally keep for myself, because I had already agreed to handle it. Jordan looked at the schedule and offered to take it. My first response formed automatically. "I've got it." The words reached the back of my teeth before I noticed them. A week earlier, I would have said them and felt virtuous afterward. Instead, I looked at Jordan and said thank you. She nodded and moved on to the next thing on her screen. No ledger appeared between us. No future argument gained a hidden weapon. She was simply making room for me, and I let her. That evening, I was at home when Eli called. His name appeared on my screen, and something in me tightened before I answered. Dad's family gathering was approaching. Eli still had no guaranteed outside job. The one realistic opportunity remained only an opportunity, not an offer he could depend on. He did not make me guess. He told me he had made a decision. He was going to resign from Calder Heritage before Dad gathered us all together to decide where everyone stood. There was no triumph in his voice, only fear and a strange steadiness underneath it. He did not have another job waiting. I had not promised him one. And for the first time in his adult life, Eli was about to make a major financial decision without knowing whether Richard or I would catch him afterward. He was going to leave anyway. Eli resigned before Dad had a chance to gather us around another table. Eli called me after he resigned and told me the formal part had been simple. He was leaving his operating role and would cooperate with the ordinary transition. He did not reconstruct Dad's expressions or give me a dramatic version of the room. He repeated only what mattered. Dad's first assumption was that I had already promised him a Meridian Loop position, money, or some private guarantee. Eli told him the truth. I had offered no job, no money, and no safety net beyond the practical help we had already discussed. The resignation belonged to Eli, which was exactly what made it meaningful. For several seconds after Eli told me that, I stood beside my office window looking down at the winter traffic and felt the weight of what he had actually done. His realistic outside opportunity was still only an opportunity. Mara's salary and their savings gave them time, not immunity. The club membership, vacations, school costs, and all the other decisions they had discussed were no longer theoretical sacrifices attached to some future act of courage. The resignation had turned them into consequences. That was why it meant something. Dad responded by making his own consequences explicit. Dad told him that walking away could mean losing future inheritance, discretionary financial help, and the family privileges that remained his to give. He could not touch what Eli and Mara already owned. He could withhold what was still his. Eli admitted he was frightened and had answered only that he understood. That answer stayed with me because it was not bravado. He had not said the money meant nothing or that Dad could no longer hurt him. The money still mattered. His children, mortgage, and future still mattered. He had simply decided those things could not make the choice for him. I had spent years treating independence as the state of being untouchable by someone else's money. Eli was showing me that sometimes freedom meant remaining vulnerable and acting anyway. Mom changed next, though more quietly. Dad had relied on Meredith for so long that her role had become nearly invisible. He created the pressure. She translated it into concern. He made a threat. She described it as hurt. He demanded compliance. She asked us not to make things worse. By the time his words reached us through her, control often sounded enough like love that resisting it made us feel cruel. After Eli resigned, Dad expected her to perform that function again. She refused. Mom told me about it herself. She did not recount the entire argument or try to convince me that she had suddenly become a different person. She only said Dad had wanted her to call Eli and me, soften what had happened, and make us understand how deeply we were hurting the family. This time she had told him she would not call threats concern anymore. The sentence was small compared with everything Dad had said over the previous 2 weeks. It altered something anyway. Mom was not leaving him that afternoon. She was not announcing a divorce or pretending 30-plus years of shared habits, assets, and social life could disappear because she had finally named one pattern correctly. She still sounded frightened by the instability around her, but she had stopped doing the work that made Dad's control easier to live with. He experienced that as betrayal. I experienced it as the first time Mom allowed one of his actions to reach us without wrapping it in softer language. Dad came for me next. He did not arrive at Meridian Loop. By then, even he seemed to understand that my company was not family territory. He called, and I answered because the argument was no longer about information I needed to protect. He accused me of pulling the family apart while pretending my hands were clean. Eli's resignation, Mom's refusal to intervene, the sudden questioning of things everyone had accepted for years. Dad saw a single source behind all of it: me. More specifically, my money. He said $14.3 billion had changed the way everyone looked at me. He believed I had made invisible promises, even if I was careful enough not to put them in writing. In his mind, Eli would never abandon a secure career unless he knew his billionaire sister would rescue him when things became difficult. For once, I did not need to defend my motives. I only needed to point at what had actually happened. I pointed to what had actually happened. Eli had received no job, money, or guarantee from me. He had left because Dad made staying conditional on obedience. When Dad said I had poisoned everyone against him, I refused to argue about whether his behavior came from love, pride, fear, or his belief that providing for people entitled him to loyalty. I could not prove what lived inside his head, and I no longer needed to. The family was responding to what he had done. Later that day, Dad confirmed the gathering for Sunday, January 10 at 6. He described it as the last opportunity to stop tearing the family apart before he made permanent decisions about his estate and future support. I understood what he wanted: one room where everyone could see the price of disagreeing with him. When I read the time, I thought about Christmas dinner. The crystal, the champagne, the small laugh after Dad asked whether I was still broke. Back then, I had entered the room hoping only to survive another family evening without becoming its target. This time, I knew exactly why I was going. Not to persuade Dad that I deserved an inheritance. Not to make him admire Meridian Loop. Not to prove my net worth was larger than whatever number he had written beside my name in his estate plan. I was going to reject the inheritance directly. Whatever he chose to leave me could no longer remain on the table as evidence that I was secretly fighting for his money. If he wanted to remove me, he could. If he wanted to give everything to someone else, that was his decision. What he could not do was make me bid against him for my own family. Dad called once more after I confirmed I would attend. His voice had settled into the cold certainty I remembered from childhood, the tone that meant he believed consequences would succeed where persuasion had failed. He reminded me that Eli had children, that Mom had a life she was accustomed to, that refusing money was easier when a person had more than she could ever spend. I listened without interrupting. Then, Dad gave me the reason he wanted me in that room. Then come watch what choosing you cost them. The call ended soon afterward. After the call, I let his sentence sit without turning it into a problem I had to solve. If everyone chose differently, only because my $14 billion guaranteed that nothing would hurt, money would still be deciding where they stood. Sunday would test whether I could let the cost remain real. The room Dad chose for the final gathering was quieter than the one he had chosen for Christmas. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. There were no candles reflected in crystal, no tasting menu designed to impress us, no champagne waiting for a toast. But the architecture of the evening was still unmistakably his. The chairs had been arranged before anyone arrived. Dad sat where he could see every face. Mom was beside him. Eli had been placed across from me, as though our positions required visual confirmation. Even without Christmas decorations, Richard Calder knew how to turn a table into a hierarchy. On December 23rd, I had entered a room like this, hoping only that he would leave me alone. That seemed almost embarrassing now. Back then, I had measured the success of family dinners by whether I escaped without becoming the evening's lesson. I watched Dad's moods, accepted small insults, and let Mom smooth whatever became sharp because avoiding conflict felt cheaper than challenging the structure underneath it. This time, I took my seat, knowing I did not need the room to approve of me. That knowledge did not make me calm. Eli had resigned without another job guaranteed. Mom had begun refusing the role she had played for decades. Dad had promised to make the cost of those choices visible. I could survive whatever he removed from my future. They would feel the consequences differently. That was what frightened me. Dad did not waste time pretending the gathering was social. He said he had spent his life building things that were meant to outlast him. Calder heritage, property, investments. A family that, in his words, had benefited from the discipline and sacrifice required to create all of it. He had no intention of leaving wealth to people who treated what he built with contempt. I listened while he translated disagreement into disrespect. Then he made the terms specific. I was out. There was no dramatic document placed in front of me. No lawyer stood beside him. Dad did not need any of that to make the point. Whatever future gifts he controlled, he intended to remove me from them. I had already given him that answer at Christmas. Keep it. But he was not finished. He turned to Eli. The threat was more complicated there because Eli had once expected a future in which Calder heritage, Dad's support, and eventually some share of his estate remained part of the same continuous life. Dad made it clear that resignation had changed that expectation. If Eli continued down the path he had chosen, he should expect nothing, simply because he was Richard Calder's son. Eli's face remained still, but I saw his fingers tighten once against the edge of his chair. Dad noticed it too. That was the cruelty of financial leverage. It did not require the person using it to invent pain. He only had to locate what already mattered. With Mom, the pressure was different. Richard could not erase assets or rights Mom already possessed, but decades of shared lifestyle, discretionary spending, travel, and social status gave him plenty of comfort to threaten. When he spoke about loyalty, she heard the price underneath it. Then the room shifted toward me. I felt it before anyone said anything. For 2 weeks, everyone had known I possessed the easiest possible answer. If Dad could remove millions from some future inheritance, I could replace those millions. If Eli lost status or income, I could erase the difference. If Mom's life became less comfortable, I could create another version of comfort. $14.3 billion could turn Richard's ultimatum into theater. All I had to do was bid higher. I looked at Eli first, then Mom. The temptation was still there, weaker than the night Eli first asked me for a job but not gone. I wanted the people I loved to walk out of that room without fear. Instead, I let the cost remain theirs. Dad mistook my silence for hesitation. I looked at him. You can leave your money to anyone you want. What you don't get to buy is the meaning of our choices. The sentence sounded quieter than I expected. I told them I would not contest being removed from Dad's estate, reimburse Eli for whatever inheritance he lost, or recreate Dad's system with myself at the center. Dad stared at me as if I had broken the rules of a negotiation. He had expected resistance, not a refusal to negotiate for loyalty at all. Then he found the place where he could still hurt me. He said Eli and Mom were not suddenly standing beside me because they had discovered some great moral truth. They were doing it because the family had learned I was richer than anyone imagined. If the message at Christmas had said $14,000 instead of $14 billion, Dad suggested nobody would have cared about my version of events. The accusation slipped under defenses the inheritance threat could not touch. I had wondered the same thing. After Christmas, every changed expression had frightened me in some small way. Eli's new attention, Mom's willingness to question Dad. Even family silence felt different once everyone knew the scale of my wealth. Part of me wanted proof that the money had nothing to do with any of it. But demanding that proof would have created another test, another price for belonging. I could have told Eli that if he truly loved me, he should walk away from Dad's estate. I could have required Mom to choose my side publicly. I could have withheld help until everyone performed independence correctly. That would only have been Richard's system wearing my face. I can't control why anyone chooses me, I said. And I'm not going to make them pass a financial test to prove it. For once, Dad had nothing ready. The silence that followed was not victory. It was space. Eli used it first. He pushed his chair back and stood. I looked up at Eli, but he did not look at me. He was not performing a choice between a billionaire sister and a wealthy father. He did not thank me, praise me, or denounce Dad. He said only that he could not build the rest of his life around what he might receive when his father died. The words were plain enough that there was nowhere for anyone to hide inside them. He was willing to receive nothing. Then he left. The door closed softly, and Dad stared at the empty chair that had belonged to the son who once seemed safest inside his system. Mom moved next. She did not stand immediately. Her hands remained folded in front of her, and for a few seconds she looked older than she had at Christmas, not weaker, just tired in a way expensive rooms had always hidden. She told Dad she was not leaving the table because Naomi was right about everything. I was grateful for that. I did not need to become the new authority whose version everyone accepted. Mom said she was leaving because she could no longer participate in a family where disagreement had a price attached to it. Richard tried to interrupt. She did not let him turn the moment into another discussion she would eventually soften for him. Mom stood, collected her coat, and told me she would decide what came next for herself. Then she left too. Dad and I remained. With 2 empty chairs between us. He still had his wealth, company, properties, and estate. Nothing material had been taken from him. The difference was visible in what the room no longer did. Nobody adjusted a decision because he might reward or punish it later. The money was still real. Its authority was not. Dad looked at me across the table. For the first time since I was a child, I did not see the man who controlled what happened next. I saw a wealthy 63-year-old man sitting alone with everything he still owned. I stood. There was no satisfaction in humiliating him. I had already learned what public humiliation did to people at Christmas. I did not need to return the favor. I picked up my coat. Dad's estate was still his. His money was still his. So I gave him the same answer I had given when $14.3 billion first appeared on my phone. Keep it. Then I walked out and left him with the one thing money had never been able to guarantee: an empty room. Several months passed before I understood what had really changed that night. Dad remained chairman of Calder Heritage and remained wealthy. His hotels, properties, and investments continued exactly as before. The consequences were quieter. Family plans no longer formed automatically around his calendar. Mom stopped translating his arguments, and Eli was no longer at Calder Heritage whenever Dad wanted business and family loyalty to become the same thing. Money had not disappeared. The assumption that it answered every question had. Eli's life became smaller in ways he could actually measure. He eventually accepted a solid operating position outside Calder Heritage. The company was respectable, the work suited him, and the salary was substantially lower than what he had been earning under Dad. There was no executive car attached to it, and no club membership hiding inside his compensation package. The title did not impress people at the same dinners, where Richard Calder's name once made conversations easier. For the first few months, Eli and Mara followed the budget they had worked out. The club membership disappeared, the expensive vacation was postponed, and they became more deliberate about what they spent. The children stayed in their school through the year, with costs to be reconsidered at the next enrollment point, instead of through a panicked mid-year move. Their savings gave them time, not a permanent replacement for income. None of those changes were catastrophic, but they were concrete enough to prove that Eli had not made a cost-free gesture at Dad's table. I never hired him or reimbursed the gap between his old salary and the new one. Sometimes I still wanted to erase an irritating bill or postponed repair simply because I could. I had to remind myself that he had not walked away from Dad to become dependent on a different Calder. The strangest thing was that losing financial comfort made our relationship easier. Before, almost every disagreement between us contained our father somewhere inside it. Eli defended choices tied to Calder Heritage. I defended my distance from it. Even when neither of us mentioned Dad, we were often arguing with what the other person represented. Once Eli built a life outside that system, we had less to defend. Sometimes he called just to complain about work. Sometimes I complained back. Neither conversation required a family position statement. Mom's change was slower. Meredith Calder had spent decades believing that keeping everyone at the same table was proof the family was healthy. That habit did not disappear because she finally recognized the price attached to some of those tables. She still hated conflict. She still occasionally started sentences with the old instinct to tell me what Dad probably meant before stopping herself. She still missed the ease of a life where one person made most large decisions and everyone else adjusted around them. But she no longer carried his messages to me. If Dad complained that I was being stubborn, Mom did not call and ask me to soften. If he said Eli had thrown away an extraordinary career, she did not repeat it until my brother doubted himself. She began making plans without first checking whether they fit Dad's preferences. Nothing dramatic. A lunch she wanted to attend. A weekend arranged around her own interests. financial decisions involving assets already in her name that she had once automatically discussed as though Dad's approval completed them. I never asked whether she intended to leave him. That was not my choice either. For the first time, I understood that demanding Mom prove her growth with a divorce would only be another way of telling an adult woman what decision would make her acceptable to me. Her progress belonged to her. Mine appeared one afternoon in the least impressive possible place, a repair shop. My 6-year-old car had developed a problem that could not be fixed before closing. The mechanic told me they needed to keep it overnight. I stood near the service counter with my phone already in my hand, preparing to order a car home. Then Eli called. He had been nearby and offered to pick me up. My first instinct was immediate. No need. I could get myself home. I could afford a car service every day for the rest of my life if I wanted one. Accepting a ride was unnecessary. My thumb hovered over the app. I thought about Jordan bringing takeout, the rental car years earlier, and the many small refusals I had once mistaken for proof that nobody could control me. For a few seconds, the old logic still felt safer. I could order a car, pay for it myself, and owe nobody anything. Then I put the phone away. Eli picked me up 20 minutes later, his car smelling faintly of spilled coffee with work papers tucked behind one seat. Nothing about him looked like the executive dad had once presented as the family standard, and nothing about me needed to perform wealth either. When I thanked him, he glanced over and said accepting one ride did not give him voting rights over my weekend. I laughed before I could stop myself. Nothing about the moment belonged in a story about $14 billion. It was simply my brother helping me get home, with no future claim waiting behind the favor. Dad contacted me not long after that. We had spoken only when necessary since the family gathering. His message was shorter than the speeches he used to send when he believed enough explanation could restore his authority. He asked to talk. I agreed. He did not give me the apology some part of me once would have demanded. He did not suddenly confess that every argument we had ever had was his fault. Richard Calder was still Richard Calder. He said he had wanted to protect what he built. He said he believed responsibility should come with influence. He still thought I had misunderstood some of his intentions, and I could hear the old instinct inside his explanations, the desire to make motive reduce consequence. I no longer needed to defeat that argument. I told him I was willing to have a relationship with him, but only under one condition. His money could not decide who got the final word, not through his estate, future gifts, business opportunities, or anything else he might pay for. If he offered something, it had to remain a gift after I accepted it. If accepting meant surrendering my right to disagree later, I did not want it. Dad was quiet. I did not ask him to answer immediately. That was another change. Years earlier, I would have treated uncertainty as danger. I would have closed the door completely rather than risk somebody walking through it with conditions attached. Now, I could leave a door open without surrendering ownership of the house behind it. Whether Dad ever learned how to enter differently was his work. I ended the call without a dramatic reconciliation and without a dramatic goodbye. Afterward, I sat for a while, thinking about December 23rd. For months, people described that Christmas dinner as the night everything changed because my phone announced $14.3 billion. The number changed what Dad knew about me, but it was not the moment I became free. That had started years earlier, when I chose the smaller investment because it preserved my right to make my own choices. The billions came later, placing a value on something I had already decided was worth protecting. What took me longer to learn was that freedom did not require becoming impossible to help. A gift could remain a gift when it left the receiver free to disagree. For years, I thought freedom meant never needing anything from anyone. I finally learned it meant being able to accept love without mistaking it for a debt.